Okay. Right, it's 4 minutes past 3. Let's make a start on what promises to be an absolutely fascinating UKAA webinar this afternoon. A topic that's close to my heart about social value, ESG, and how those play out in the built-to-rent world and elsewhere. We're very grateful today's hosts, Built ID, our partners, UK's partners in a number of interesting events, which I'll pick up on later on. And we've now got a full panel, and as you can see, it's a full panel of very experienced, very exciting speakers. For those who don't know me, I'm Dave Butler, but I'm sure everybody does know me. Just to remind you, before I hand over, that the Q&A button is on the bottom of the screen. Please do it. We'll pick up questions at the end. Is there anything you want to say amongst yourselves or to all of us, please use the chat button. At this point, then, I'll hand over to Dominic Stinton, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Built ID today, and who's going to act as our host. Over to you, Dominic.
Hi, everybody. Hope you're enjoying this not too bad afternoon, slightly damp outside, but the sun looks like it might come through later. We are going to be talking about ESG, a great acronym in an industry which absolutely loves acronyms. So environmental, social, and corporate governance. But we're going to be focusing particularly on that middle character, social, and we're going to be talking about social value or impact and what that means, how to measure it, some of the challenges that industry finds in delivering it. And we're also going to talk a little bit about people-centric design. We've got some really good panelists here today, so I'll let them introduce themselves to tell us and tell you all what their particular focus and role is as far as ESG. So I might start with Alex first.
Hi there, yeah, I'm Alex Notay. I'm a fund director responsible for placemaking and ESG investment across our funds, residential-led funds at PFP Capital, with a fund and asset management arm of the Places for People Group, which is one of the largest registered providers in the country, but also has a huge range of other kind of activity and tenures. And my experience and passion around this area, I've worked around sort of sustainability and social impacts in various forms for about 15 years. I've worked for the World Economic Forum, the Urban Land Institute, the Cabinet Office on various different kind of metrics and benchmarks, and about translating from the kind of theoretical and the sort of tick box to actually the impacts of for people and for places.
Very good, thanks Alex. Natalie, can I hand over to you?
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a commercial real estate lawyer. I work at Greenberg, Traurig. Before I became a commercial real estate lawyer, I was a community organiser, working mostly in East London and North London, trying to engage communities on issues such as development, employment, access to healthcare, and also being paid a London living wage. I worked on that campaign as well. I work for clients who develop around London, all different types of developments, including some with social impact, as well as working with local authorities to deliver local amenities such as schools, nurseries, and adult education as well. I'm also a trustee of the Creative Land Trust with Alex as well, which is a project which is trying to deliver affordable workspace for artists across London.
Brilliant. Felicity.
Hi everybody, and firstly thank you very much for inviting me onto the panel today. I'm really excited that we're talking about this topic. I'm really excited to see this gaining more and more traction. Because it really shows how important it is to everybody now. So my background, I've worked in the investment management industry for the past 15 years, Seabury Global Investors, Kane International. I'm also a member of the IPF Operations Board. And my involvement really with ESG has been from the hat of the investment management side, looking at how we tackle and how we grasp it and how we kind of make that sort of part of our processes within investment management. And you know, as Alex said, it's moving from a tick box exercise that was 5 years ago to actually action points around it. I think it's really interesting to see how sort of the S in the ESG is now, you know, we'll really talk about the social side, and we're probably 5 years or so behind where the environmental and sustainability piece has gone. So I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that. And I'm just really passionate about making sure investment management industry really are good custodians on behalf of our investors and move this forward.
Very good, thanks Felicity. And Emily.
Sorry, I was just on mute there. Hi, I'm Emily Laverick, Marketing Director at Built ID. I run all of our marketing activities across projects and own brand. We're a social impact company powering the community engagement platform Give My View. We work with developers and local authorities to help them reach the most diverse group of voices in the community and make it easier for whole communities to give their view on the local built environment. Every consultation we hold also has an immediate positive impact on the communities that we're working in. And yet that is how I sort of drive my passion for community engagement and social value.
Very good. Thanks, Emily. Of course, I know Emily. We work together. I think that's it. don't think Liam's joined, has he?
Oh, he is, yeah.
Oh, is he there? Great. Fantastic.
Sorry.
Liam, there you are. Great.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Liam Ronan-Chlond. I'm the engagement and social value lead at First Space. We're a mixed-use property developer delivering places to live, work and play across the south of England, including Bristol, Brighton, Milton Keynes, Cambridge, London as well. So my background is mainly in local government, and social value is a particular interest for me. I'm just been sitting on the UK Green Building Council's task group to define social value for the built environment as well. So looking forward to speaking a bit about that here as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, panelists. So please, as we chat over, say, the next half hour or so, if anyone has any questions, just fire them up. We'll try to keep 10 minutes or so for those questions at the end. But I'm going to kick straight off. I'm going to ask Alex, first of all. We talk about ESG and social impact, social value, and that's something you've told me in the past fits very conveniently into what you call the terminology soup that's so beloved of the real estate industry. So what I'd like to ask you is, how have semantics impacted on the planning process? And do these sort of semantics around social value or social impact accelerate or impede progress?
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, I have a bit of a thing for excessive use of acronyms from when I was a civil servant, and I'd spent a good half an hour in a meeting at Treasury talking about CSR before I realised with two colleagues that we all meant 3 different versions of CSR. It could be corporate spending review or corporate social responsibility or some other tax term that I didn't know. So yeah, I have a real thing about precision of language. And I think one of my bugbears with the real estate industry is that it's so incredibly siloed. And so, just by the fact that you can call it real estate, built environment, urban planning, property, construction, people will define themselves very differently within those kind of wider silos. You then have incredible professional specialisms, investment management, architecture, law, community engagement. And very often, with the best of intentions, you can do a pop pass of the rugby and the ball drops down the middle in the kind of grey areas between. Planning is kind of one of the places that gets the blame frequently because it's meant to hold everything together. But actually, as a system, I mean, even before yesterday's intriguing announcements, it was a system that was kind of creaking in terms of being fit for purpose for the type of mixed communities that we want in the modern world. So when you overlay onto that an expectation of, the kind of community that anyone who doesn't work in our industry, you'd say to them, what would you like? They will tend to describe a place that has some retail, some open space, a bit of places to work and somewhere to hang out and feel safe, and maybe some different kinds of places to live. They'll describe a mixed use community. What we've inadvertently done because of all those professional and policy silos is we create, kind of by the virtue of the red line and the investment mandate and the control is pockets. We've just got the fact that there isn't that linear control from the start to the end of a process. And the challenge for me, I think, with social value particularly, but with any kind of ESG element, is that you can only really track it if you set that benchmark of what you're trying to achieve right at the beginning, and then you manage it all the way through the development, the planning, the build and the operations. And actually, it's very, very rare that you get a developer or an investor of scale who's willing and able to do that. So that's one of the challenges we have in the case, finding a way to simplify all the methodologies and make it a bit more tangible. So people like Liam and Natalie working on the kind of front line with communities have the tools that help them generate real social value.
And just going back to Liam, you mentioned that you're on the UK Green Building Council's new social value task group, I believe. When you think about social value as a definition, would it be true to say that that is perhaps less easily understood compared with green issues or green value?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why the UK Green Business Council wanted to look into this. So, and as well, you know, what's the perceived difference between social value, social impact, social responsibility, and you know, how can it be taken seriously when nobody understands it? I had an example last year when a certain council phoned me up and asked us what we were going to be doing for social value that Christmas. I was like, what do you mean what we're going to be doing for social value this Christmas? You know, it's a sort of 20-year sort of strategy. And then I realized after they meant sort of CSR, they meant just, you know, a sort of charity endeavor, basically. So it's easy to be confused. But then you get some other councils, so Camden, for instance, who I used to work for, that are running workshops with the developers, with the community. Not only do they seem to get what social value is, they're also seem to be, you know, pathfinders as well. And I know Neighbour in Islington are leading the way with social value as well. So, and like you say, you know, I didn't touch anything then. I just seemed to vanish.
Yeah,
I think I'm back now.
Me.
Okay, so I was going to say communities don't understand what the social value is, and also I think that the way that we talk about social value sometimes can be really almost sort of too big to understand. So for our Brighton project, we were talking about how we're going to create £400 million worth of social value over the next 20 years. And it quickly dawned on me that that was not only too big a figure, but too long a living around the corner to us from our site. It can almost be meaningless. So I've learned a lot of lessons about how to sort of bring that down to reality and try and explain that this means that, you know, that the young person living next door to you can be an apprentice on site, or the coffee shop around the corner can benefit from the potential trade that's going to be created from the homes that we're going to build. And it's basically, it's explaining things in tangible terms. But going back to your original point about sustainability, I think the Social Value Act of 2012, so we've only been talking about this for 8 years, which is a long time, but you know, if you look back at sustainability as a sort of as a theme, as a sort of movement, you know, we've gone from talking about the ozone layer when I was in school and CFCs to talking about, you know, the climate emergency and having a target of net zero carbon, you know, in 10 years. So it's become a lot more clearer, and there's a lot more. It's a lot more clinical these days. And I think social value probably has more of a journey to go on before we get a clearer understanding of what it is, what it can do. We'll hopefully have more examples, and I think that'll help social value be understood by a wider audience.
So you'd probably describe yourself as a glass half full kind of person, I guess, Liam. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
And let's just ladder back up to, we talked about, I think you talked about a figure there with Camden Council of 400 million or so. Let's think about the money, men and women. Felicity, what does kind of social impact look like now on a balance sheet? You've talked in the past about ESG being a bit of a box ticking exercise for investors. Have we come any further from that? What kind of levels of self-reflection are going on in boardrooms when it comes to taking this seriously?
Unmute myself. I think it's quite interesting if we look at how investors have typically approached underwriting an investment. And to date, it has been your traditional metrics, you know, your rents, your yields, what happens to the property, how can I get my financial return from it? And being frank, I think that's what the industry was doing for a very long time, and it still does. You know, we're there to hopefully invest money, to make money for our investors, which are usually the man in the street. It's usually pension schemes. You know, we're not all big evil investment managers getting rich on it. We are trying to make money on behalf of our pension fund holders usually. So I think what it is a bit of a mindset change. So something that I've started to see over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is seeing, and on the sustainability side, that metrics are starting to come into the underwriting process. So when we're looking at a potential asset to acquire, that actually, it becomes a big significant part of, say, your investment memorandum committee paper. So you'll go in and you'll actually talk about what you're doing around that. Now, the social value bit is something that still isn't necessarily quite in that conversation yet, but it's certainly being talked around the business in terms of how we're going to do it. And I think actually something that Alex said at the start, which is very pertinent, is that kind of glue sticking it together. I actually think the power potentially the investment management industry is the ability to bring those groups together, because it has a very strong kind of overseeing role as a fiduciary manager of this capital. It should really be doing that, you know, I don't even want to say cradle to grave journey anymore because we're a circular economy, but really looking at that round trip and like who's involved in it and how are we going to do this that's sustainable for the generations. And when I say sustainable, I mean financially, I mean environmentally, I mean socially. So look, I think we're still very much at the start of the conversation, but you know, what I have definitely seen is a move and a genuine desire from investment management companies to want to look at this properly and move it from words into action. We're just, you know, Liam's summed it up very well. And again, Alex, let's start with the terminology soup. There's just still so much that people are trying to get their head around. But what I do think is important is that we do something and not nothing. And there's probably going to be a bit of an iterative process over the next many years, actually many years, but certainly in the next few years it'll be an iterative process where we need to be having these types of conversations where, you know, you look at the panel we've got together, we're all coming from different points of view and you're starting to ask questions and understanding different viewpoints to get to the point that we can actually hopefully start to measure, start to monitor, start to understand what exactly is social impact, social value, you know, and refine how we are approaching it. So I think the investment management industry is definitely taking that seriously and definitely sees its responsibility as the manager of capital to invest time and resources and energy into it.
That's brilliant. I'd quite like to pick that point up with Alex a bit later in terms of, you know, does the investment management industry, can that fill the gaps in the planning system? But before that, I just want to sort of go to Natalie. How is social impact being talked about at kind of grassroots level? Are communities trusting developers and councils more or less, in your view, in this regard?
I think there are two different levels of discussions. I think there's one level where you have people who've grown up in kind of inner city London communities who are now university educated and working in the corporate world and effectively want to reinvest into their community. So that's one set of conversations. And then you have another set of conversations with people who live in the community, might not necessarily be as educated, but because of what's been happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously, unfortunately, the things that happen with Grenfell, they're much more alive and much more politically aware about the role that developers play in their local communities and the effect that that has on their day-to-day lives. If I'm honest with you, there isn't a lot of trust there, because I think ultimately you do have a planning system which people can contribute to, but not everybody appreciates how that planning system works. It can appear very convoluted to people. And ultimately what you have is a lot of communities that don't trust the council, so don't engage, and then effectively they find that places are made for them and that things that are sustainable development are placed on them, and those things don't actually kind of meet their needs or actually even add any perceived benefit to them. So we are seeing more conversations. I think you're seeing a lot of groups coming together to decide what they can do in terms of like collective ownership of community assets. Also thinking about kind of how property ownership empowers communities. I know there are a few organisations, I'm part of one of them, called In My Community, which is a group of people who've grown up in and around South London or similar areas, coming together to try and figure out how they can guarantee a community long-term benefit for the Black community that's lived in those type of areas for the last 20 to 25 years. So you are seeing activism, and I think this period of being on quarantine because of COVID, the threat of unemployment and a recession, as well as kind of the historic legacies of things that have happened in the past, are really leading to more grassroots action. And I think we will see more empowerment of these communities when it comes to developments and changes to the environment that they live in on a day-to-day basis.
If I can just jump in on that
really
quickly, one of the things that got me into kind of urbanism and cities, the point when, you know, it wasn't, I didn't do a conventional route into real estate by any means, but was reading Jane Jacobs, as community organizer, and, you know, there's an incredible book, you know, The Death and Life of Great American Cities is like the best book to read about kind of place and planning. But she led a campaign against a caricature like evil New York developer to save and preserve a community, and became a massive world authority on the importance of those places. And exactly what Natalie is touching on is that the challenge that we have from the development and the investment side is that even with the best of intentions, very often what we do in regeneration is being done to communities. And gentrification can have good elements, but it can have bad. And existing community, there is nowhere really, unless we're genuinely building on a kind of a former factory that has no existing community. Everywhere has some people who will value things, but a few days with some post-its in a community hall is not enough to kind of nurture them. And so tools like Built Idea are really, really important, and helping to reach people who otherwise might not be reached. But there's so much more you need to do that in kind of an ongoing process. And I think understanding the legacy of places, like Natalie refers to, like Black Lives Matter, and I live in Bristol, so, the whole thing we've had around the Colston statue and the name, that has been an argument going on for decades, but that nobody really had the guts to really press and tackle and go to. But it has now catalyzed a huge amount of reflection that hopefully will spiral out into kind of other things that could be really positive about what places mean for the people who live and work there, really day to day, what it's like.
And Emily, I mean, talking about, give my view, and what Natalie was talking about in regard to actually there isn't much trust, and things are being, foisted upon them, whether they like it or not. I mean, what sort of community engagement are you seeing on the platform? Are you seeing kind of a lot of cynical voices, or are you seeing some rays of hope, and are people feeling empowered at all?
I think there's sort of a mixture. I was speaking to someone just before we came on this panel, actually, and they were saying they'd done a survey and they'd asked whether people trust developers or not, and I think 2% of people said that they did, and they were actually surprised that they got 2%. But yeah, on the platform generally we see sort of a key sort of set of concerns, and the main concerns that we see from the community are pretty consistent throughout the consultations that we do, whether it's sort of in Bristol, London, Cambridge, and they're usually around sustainability, social isolation, gentrification, as we mentioned, and particularly local infrastructure, so the pressure on like GPs and local schools. And they want to see the infrastructure put into place to support these big developments so it doesn't completely disrupt their daily lives, as Alex said, when they can't get a GP appointment or a school place, or even like a parking space. And it's things that need to be considered that are going to interrupt communities' daily lives. And we also get a lot of feedback around having accessible and inclusive community spaces, and we find that any sort of campaigns that we do around sustainability always perform brilliantly, as communities across the board are always quite invested in creating environmentally conscious developments, whether it's sort of green public leisure space or increasing biodiversity. There's quite a lot of key themes, and we do get quite a lot of constructive feedback, particularly in the closed feedback loop that other people can't read, if you know what I mean, so they feel maybe more safe saying it, I'm not sure. But yeah, that's generally what we find.
And going back to Felicity, so you've got all of these sort of ideas kind of bubbling up from grassroots. How do these then kind of get translated into kind of investment decisions?
Sorry.
Oh, you might be.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute me. I think at the top level, it's probably not being done at the level that it needs to be done. From the discussion that we've had over the last 5 to 10 minutes, it's very clear to see that the power and that what we need to be engaging with is directly in those communities to make sure that we're not doing things at them or placing it on them. And are those kind of discussions happening in the boardrooms, investment committees? I don't think so, not yet. Not broadly, not as a standard, not saying no one's doing it at all, but I think it's something that's starting to come through, and it will need to be working with those companies that are doing the direct engagement. So it will be the likes of you guys, the work that Liam's doing. I think we need to be focusing on how we're actually going to go about engaging wherever we want to make an investment, and doing that really up front, before we all get excited about the acquisition possibility. But maybe actually that needs to come in much further forward, rather than thinking just about that asset, actually thinking about that asset in that community and how is it operating at the moment, what's it doing, before you kind of get ahead of yourself and start again jumping into those financial metrics, like which are the groups that, you know, who is this going to be affecting, which are the really strong community groups that operate in the area that we need to engage with first, in order to really understand how projects can change, how projects can develop, and how projects can impact. So I think it's being done in some places, but I just don't think it's a standard question that's being asked everywhere. And
Natalie, I mean, how realistic, desirable, or fair would it be for the community to be involved, you know, maybe face to face a lot more in those very early investment decisions, or is that just a pipe dream?
I think that's a pipe dream, because I think ultimately you have to accept that communities might not be that understanding of the fact that developments need to make money. They may appreciate in kind of an overall macro point, but they'll be more concerned about what it is in it, not what is in it for them, but how it impacts their lives. So I think what needs to happen at investment levels, there needs to be a wider understanding of the communities that you invest in. So for example, you know, I hear about lots of different investments, and you see kind of boards going up, but it's very clear, very obvious to me, especially as a real estate professional, that that developer doesn't really know anything about the widening community. And I think that when we are thinking about investing in certain areas, we should kind of take that extra step before we even make a decision to understand what the community is, what is the landscape, what is the ethnic makeup, what are the class makeups, because ultimately at investment level, you've already got a mock-up of what you want to build, what you want to do, how things need to be in order for the balance sheet to look right for you. And so if you really want to commit to social value, you need to understand that the environment that you're going to start working in before you actually spend the money and start the work. So understanding the community should really become an overall consideration, and not just a tick box, but something that you must do as part of the process when considering to invest or to redevelop in a particular area. I think that's a better way to start the investigation earlier on in the process, rather than think about it just before you need to submit planning to make sure that it goes through on committee. But I think kind of, go ahead, sorry, Alex.
So, and I don't think it is, I think it does happen. I just think it's not universal. So, you know, I was like, you know, that's what we do. Yeah. I know that's what Liam does know. So I'm in the middle of a consultation that we've been doing for 6 months, and we're not putting planning in for another 6 to 12 for a very large mixed-use scheme for 1,500 new homes in Bristol. And that's all about making sure that it's community-led, genuinely community-led. The challenge, I think, is about the kind of the smaller schemes and the traditional, like, middle-sized developers that don't have that expertise or, frankly, interest.
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be kind of, you're seeing a change in attitude, whereas you will definitely do it because of the concerns that you have and the fact that it's passionate for you. And if this could be rolled out across the board and become more of a standard process, I think that would be really helpful.
And if we sort of jump, so I was going to ask Liam, actually, if we sort of jump forward into delivery, of when plans are actually being rolled out, where do you see kind of weaknesses? So all this great planning might have taken place up front with all the best of intentions, but then when an actual project is actually at the sort of sharp end of delivery, where do you see things falling down?
So I wanted to add to the previous conversation as well, but it links in. During my time as a consultant before I worked for First Space, I saw firsthand the disconnect between what a developer thought was acceptable and what the community wanted, and especially in cities like London, where the community often, you know, the community's aspirations for a local development would be nothing less than 100% social housing, you know, or a medical centre or a school or a community centre, and nothing else, nothing commercial. Whereas a developer would want it purely commercial, no affordable. I remember speaking to one developer about asking him about what community benefits there were, and he seriously thought that just the building looking nicer than the building that was there before, was a community benefit. Just, you know, aesthetic design and nothing else. And so there's a real disconnect between people. So between these two groups. And I think one of the reasons why I enjoy working at First Space is we can take a longer term view, and that incentivizes us to sort of lay down roots and to try and understand what makes a good community, but what also the existing community needs, because we're going to be there for a long time. So we need to be a good neighbour. So that's one of the reasons why I like working at First Space, because, you know, we can do things. I was in Bristol last week. We helped our local primary school celebrate the 275th anniversary of their namesake with a mural and that was Hannah More, a Bristol-born poet and playwright, anti-slavery campaigner, basically human rights activist from the sort of 19th century. So we can do great work because we've got a social value plan, and we're going to be there for a long time. But, and that's also one of the things that worries me about these recent announcements, is potentially you're going to have a lot of people thinking they're going to make a quick buck and going into communities, taking advantage of new legislations and basically taking advantage of communities around them who will have little control to, do anything about it. And that really makes it harder for us as a developer who are trying to do the right thing, to build trust in the communities that we're working in, because then again, we're the London property developer coming into a location that doesn't know us, and we've got an uphill battle to try and turn those perceptions around. And we don't mind doing hard work, so we're going to be there for a long time, but it can still be an uphill battle trying to fight against those perceptions. So going on to delivery, it's harder to action delivery because you're fighting against the sort of the lack of trust from the community. So they're not fully as fully bought in as they could be, because they don't believe you're really going to do it. You've got a council that doesn't really understand. Well, you have councils that don't necessarily understand what social value is, so they're not really monitoring it as part of the planning consent. You've got a contractor that's potentially sort of said all the right things so they can win the bid, but then when it comes to it, they'll hand social value to a junior member of staff maybe, and not take it as seriously as they did. And then potentially you might have developers as well who sort of say, well, this sounds good, doesn't it, this social value thing, whatever, we'll do that, we'll say we're doing that, and then just ignore it or sell the site on, and then the social value disappears into thin air. So delivery is very difficult, and it needs someone to be hands-on, committed to it, and think, we're going to do this. And you need to pull people together, local community, contractors, people within your own project team, and make it happen. And also because because it's quite new, there's not really any sort of, you can't just pull in sort of, an immediate guidebook or expertise to sort of say, this is how to deliver a successful social value project over 20 years. So we're all learning. And I think, there's some of the challenges from delivery. And that was a bit of a rant from me. Sorry.
No, it feels like in lots of ways quite a circular conversation, but one which is, albeit moving forwards slowly, albeit in circles, like I said. Going back, Alex, to your points at the beginning, how can absolute clarity of positive intentions be achieved in an industry that likes to revel in complex codified language? How can we dismantle the complexity of semantics around this, which is perhaps leading to the problems that Liam's just been talking about?
Yeah. Well, my personal pet hate is to kind of betonize the word vibrant on hoarding. Will always make me slightly shudder, because it just, to me, is just the one that is just, any developer chucks in a hoarding and says, there you go, that's good enough, it's catch-all. This is a UKAA event, and so I think one of the key things is to look at the subsector that is built to rent. We have talked a lot in that sector, which I've been involved in for kind of 10, 12 years, about the importance of community. And actually, it's been very, very interesting when you're talking to local authorities and planners, trying to talk about what, yes, we're building predominantly apartment schemes, but not always, sometimes houses. And yes, there's amenity, but it's not all about the amenity. The market started out at the premium end because it's an easier place to start. But actually you can have very much more kind of mid-range and affordable. There's different types of product. It's not all about the amenity, it is about the service. And it is possible to have an affordable rent and a high quality service and a good community experience. And there are all these, from an operational side of things, statistics that we know that you can improve people's well-being and productivity at work when they're not kind of isolated and lonely, and they're actually making friends within your building and within your community, and being able to do that through a way that is, there's a careful line of not kind of Club 1830s forced fun, but some kind of activated programming within a community can help you get to know people around you. And when you move to a city for the first time, whether you're from abroad or just from a different part of the country, that's something that is actually really, really valuable. Now, I think if you talk to many of my colleagues in the sector, many UKAA members, they will all have stories about skeptical planning committees who think it's just chat from developers, and they don't really buy into this idea. Actually, if you talk to every operator of a build-to-rent scheme through the lockdown, they've got endless demonstrable anecdotes to be able to share about how that community has really pulled together through this period in a way that's vastly different, frankly, to people in kind of standard PRS accommodation. So I think we're starting to see that real value of having invested in that. But you know, my mantra has always been, it's all about the service from a kind of operator point of view. If you spend that money on allowing people to have the flexible spaces to use for community events and activities, that you spend a bit of extra money having a really high quality property manager who knows everybody and can keep an eye and look after people, that will pay dividends further down the line. And you know, I have always said it, the person who is your cleaner has a bigger impact on your investors' return than anybody else, because they are the people who, you know, if they keep the building looking nice and they look up and they're friendly and they chat, they cheer somebody up in and out of the building, that person will probably have a bigger impact on your retention and therefore your voids and your rent levels and your returns. So I think from a build to rent perspective, the multi-layered value of generating community and investing in community has been really proven through lockdown. For the wider industry, I think it's going to be one of the things that we really have to learn. Retail was already undergoing enormous pressure, as was office. You know, it's going to be a whole world of something different now. And so the sector that has always made money doing the same thing over and over and over again is going to have to adapt and evolve much faster than it ever has before. And I think part of that is going to be about having much clearer language and purpose. From a very personal point of view, I'm not sure what was announced yesterday in planning terms is the way to achieve that. I think you get good intentions and unintended consequences from things like permitted development, which creates, frankly, slums and really, really poor quality, and deprives, Natalie and I know, also deprives artists and creatives of affordable workspace whilst creating terrible housing. So I think that, you know, the problem with policy is the ripple effect that happens around it is very difficult, but aiming for clarity and what we mean by community, as Liam said, what do we mean by social value, and knowing that you've got those definitions agreed up front and you're really clear about them to everybody you talk to, I think would have a really positive impact.
And just to sort of add to that, where I think the investment and institutionalising, I hate using that word, but apologies, but bringing in institutional capital into the build to rent sector is so important, because I think what Alex was just talking about, you know, there is a real opportunity to bring those standards, that quality, that, you know, trust, which we've talked about, of people in those buildings, because, you know, the responsibility of the investor in that building should be to make sure all of those topics that Alex has talked about are met and managed, and it isn't just a quick in and out for 1 or 2 years, that this is something sustainable, that you're underwriting business plans, that you're expecting this, you know, it's community. You're not doing a typical 5-year underwrite and then off I go. You know, your mindset's different. You're creating community. This is permanent. This is meanwhile. This is not in and out. So I think it's really important, and the opportunity is massive to get more institutional capital into that sector to really help it bring it forward.
And just thinking about, you know, the wider economy and how it could benefit from some of the sort of behaviours, positive behaviours that you've both been talking about. I just want to ask Natalie, like, you know, Boris Johnson's talked about, you know, the disastrous, I think, inverted commas, quote unquote, disastrous impact on the economy. Have you started seeing, Natalie, people in the community kind of demonstrating entrepreneurial initiatives, things that fall out of the people-centric designs around them, and maybe there's sort of changes to the infrastructure? Have you seen sort of wealth generation starting to come up from a grassroots itself?
Yeah, I think you've seen a lot of that. So this weekend you had the Black Pound Day, was effectively a day calling on people to specifically make sure that they buy something from a Black-owned business. And so I believe that you'll see a lot more of those initiatives, especially being pushed through Instagram and Twitter and other forms of social media, just encouraging people to think more in terms of what they do and what they become engaged with. I think you will always have a situation where people don't naturally kind of trust the established institutions. And so you will begin to see people come together, especially where they have more time to think about it, with more initiatives like Black Pound Day. You've seen a generation of people working together to form funds, whether that's funds to support Black ownership of more businesses and more properties. We're seeing a lot of movement in that way, and local communities becoming more engaged and wanting to have more of a say about what happens. So you're definitely seeing not necessarily entrepreneurialism, but entrepreneurialism and activism kind of put together in this pot, in terms of people wanting, especially seeing what's happened with COVID, the impact it's had on BAME communities, especially inner city communities with a lack of resources. You're definitely going to see people want more self-determination. And how that will impact development, I'm not so sure in terms of the planning process and, you know, consideration of the communities that developers invest in, but definitely more so that when developers do have the intention to invest and they do have the intention to build, I think people will begin to speak up and communicate more what they want. And I think what you're seeing is people being more open to asking developers for things in the future, saying, well, I know that you're doing this project, you have the funds, this is something we're doing for the community, do you want to get involved? And I think if there are ways, if developers are investing in a particular community, to make it clear to community organisations that there is a pot or a fund or something that they will do, they can access for funds to better the community as a whole, I think that would be, especially if we're talking about being involved for years, if someone needs to set up a project and they can look at the local BTR developer and work with them for the next 5 years, they're definitely going to have a more welcome reception, not only to the development, but the people that come to live in the development as well. And that just reinforces this idea of sustainability and building a community within a wider community that already exists.
And Emily, do you see people who perhaps are maybe one step away from the kinds of people that Natalie's talking about, who are kind of getting up and doing stuff to sort of support business? Do you see people who are just wanting to get involved, but from their sofa? I mean, like, are we getting, give my view, sort of getting ideas through from people who perhaps don't have as much initiative? And how are you kind of capturing those sorts of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, on the development we did in Battersea, even before COVID, we had local artists contacting us through the platform saying that they would like to provide the art for the development, or provide a mural for like the flank wall of the development. And throughout COVID, we've had people contact us about COVID response, how they can set up sort of outlets for NHS staff as like a food bank. I've definitely seen a lot more sort of activism and as Natalie said, sort of grassroots people wanting to make a positive change in their communities, and really reaching out and leaving their phone numbers, their email addresses, saying they want to help with community gardens, or setting up and helping with creative space. There's been loads and loads of people, and it's definitely something I've noticed more throughout COVID.
And just one final question before we kind of sum up, really. Just go to Liam. I mean, are you seeing the sort of nature of the developments that you're overseeing changing to accommodate more space for these sorts of entrepreneurial, wealth generating initiatives?
I'm not sure about entrepreneurial wealth generating initiatives, but certainly I was going to follow up from Emily's point about sort of the rise in community activism. I think actually we welcome that, because it makes my job of engagement easier if things are happening locally that we can support, rather than trying to sort of make something happen when something isn't. So yeah, we're helping a local we're helping a sort of local abandoned sort of patch of land in Brighton get turned into a community garden. We're doing a community fund as well in Brighton. That's become very useful over the recent months, with obviously the impacts of coronavirus. So that's being used to help local care homes as well. So yeah, it's and also I think it forces you to be a bit more creative than just to sort of stick a community centre in. That was the old sort of idea, wasn't it? It's just like, give them a community centre, that'll do. And now there's loads of community centres and no community to fill the centres because there's so many. But yeah, just creative sort of spaces that people can use. And also I think as a mixed use developer, we try and like to use space efficiently. So supporting sort of, something that might be a sort of coffee shop during the day that can become, and then maybe used for, I don't know, yoga in the morning, but then could be used for sort of evening classes, in the evening, just to get spaces working throughout the day, not only just for the community but also for wealth generation and the people who might work there as well.
I think there's a couple of really quick like build to rent elements you can just overlay on that. So the first is that I think the early phase stuff in the UK was very much seen, particularly by a lot of local authorities and planners, as kind of ivory tower luxury apartments that were kind of very locked in. All the amenity was inside. It wasn't anything to do with the community. You're seeing a much bigger shift now. I think most quality, as Felicity, professional institutional operators, understand the value of being part of the community, of building relationships with local businesses, and having, you know, a bit of, when we're allowed to move in and out again, having a bit of fluidity in and out of the building. And I think that's a really, really important part of it as well. The other bit is from a kind of design and operation perspective. I've seen a really big shift in people trying to kind of anticipate and predict what amenity spaces people would want. They want a yoga studio, they want a cinema room, or whatever it is they might put, but actually leaving a bit of flexible space that the community, when they've moved in, can actually decide and vote on, and then it can be fitted out accordingly, so it actually responds to that community. Because with the best of intentions, you can design family units that then are occupied by sharers, or you can, you know, and then actually, or you can have a building that had no anticipation of any families at all, that then has loads of children in it, so you need a play area. And so I think leaving that flexibility to be responsive is a really key thing.
Fantastic. I feel like the sunshine's just come outside my window, and it feels like it's come into the conversation as well. I'm feeling a lot more positive from the last 20 minutes or so. I mean, before I ask the panelists to sort of wrap up, I was just wondering, David, are there any questions come in at all?
We haven't had any questions come in, but there's a few questions that spring to my mind. I think, as we were saying before the session, I'm fascinated by the word community. Alex used it a lot, and we've spoken at clinic, we've spoken at community both obliquely and as a sense of something that's important. We also emphasise the need to measure things. How do we define and measure community? I see Liam nodding his head there. If you want to have a go at that, that'd be great.
All right, yeah, good. It was a point I missed out actually when I was talking about the delivery of social value, about having to constantly record what you do, so it can be measured and it can be transparent, because, you know, you can promise things and you can say you've done things, and, like, you know, anyone working in PR can turn that into a bigger thing than it actually is. But if you actually measure things and you make that, you know, you make those public, then people can hold you to account. So if you do say we're going to deliver X amount of social value over 10 years, then the local residents association, if they wanted to, could hold you account for that figure. And so I think measurement is really important to build trust, you know, with the local community. Also sort of show the community what's possible and how things can be done right. And then maybe when they see developers, or maybe when they see social value delivered properly, then it sort of, you know, it raises the credibility of social value, and it also exposes what other people aren't doing, and it also exposes what when other people talk about social value, that it's actually not as socially valuable as they might say it is.
I think there's also a point to, like, the definition of community. It's not a homogenous, static thing. So as Natalie said, right, there are, you know, there are multi-layers, there's contradictions, there's duplication, there's ethnicity, race and religious characteristics that need to be factored in. There's residency, but there's also working community. And I think we'll see a lot more of that post-COVID, where people are living and working in a different way, but therefore spending time, more time during the day. I mean, one of the challenges we've had is a site that is in an area that's quite residential, but we've had a lot of drilling on it during the day, which wouldn't normally be an issue, because 2/3 of the people who live there would have been at work, but they've all been trying to work from home, going, you know, and those kind of things force you to engage in a slightly different way. You can get, and again, I guess that the risk is that you over define what you mean by your community of stakeholders, and therefore you shouldn't, and you go, well, those people aren't part of it, so we don't have to talk to them. You have to acknowledge that you're never going to get everybody on board, but it's about continuing to have those difficult conversations. And I know Natalie knows how to do that.
Yeah, and I think also it does come sometimes in relation to the kind of historic, the history of a place, and certain places, the people are bound not by ethnicity or even class, but by the shared history of that area as well. And so when I'm thinking about community growing up in Tottenham, I'm not necessarily thinking about ethnicity. I'm thinking about people who've been there for generations and generations, bound by the fact that they've lived in this kind of N17, N15 postcode, which over the last 20 years has a really rich history of political activism, but also a real strong cultural history in terms of creating forms of music, different ethnic groups having specific areas. Like, for example, we have like the Colombian community in the South Seven Sisters Corner, which is a really strong community. And even though I'm not Colombian, I still have a quite an affirmation towards them, simply because we're all from the same area and we've all grown up and gone to school together. So it's all different levels of community. I feel like it would be difficult to kind of try and give it a definition. I think it really does, unfortunately, depend on particular areas, which makes it difficult to quantify, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some definitions. They tend to be psychological, that is, you feel a sense of attachment to a place,
yeah,
and even more importantly, a willingness to contribute to it, to see yourself as part of it, and therefore willing to be part of it. And the challenge for me from a build-to-rent perspective is doing that, but not just doing it for the people who live in the building, but doing it for people who you affect by creating a building. Anyway, look, we may not have questions from the audience, but by goodness, I could carry on talking all afternoon. But I'm conscious that it's 5 to 3, and
I think there's one that's just come in, Dave. Actually.
Oh, right. Let's pick that one up then. Okay. Oh my goodness, that's from Harriet Jones to all the panelists, and producers, experience makers. Yes, of course, Harriet. Yeah, we're hearing more discussion about social value because of changing consumer trends across many industries, not just property. On the one hand, this could be seen as a net good, but organisations that implement social value for this purpose are still looking at consumer metrics rather than direct social impact or social value. Do the panelists think this muddies the water, or is framing social aims as a consumer interest and a way of getting investors on board? Thank you, Harriet. That's quite a long question. Who wants to pick that up?
Well, I think that there's an obvious that the idea that of the customer thing, as revelatory as it is to big chunks of the real estate market, is quite entertaining. But it's because we spent decades talking about the occupier or the end user as being, it's kind of irrelevant, really, because they hadn't been part of the value chain. Now that everything is about the customer experience and that they can actually have such an impact on, yield and leasing and return, and it's starting to happen. I think you're right that there are often people are looking for the metrics that Leah mentioned. People are looking for kind of things they can base a decision on, and at the moment those are consumer feedback rather than direct social value metrics. There are a few that exist that aren't great. I know there's a lot of work across RF, the Association of Real Estate Funds. I'm involved with some at the BPF level, British Property Federation, that we're trying to get a bit of better clarity around. There's the UK Green Business Council that Leah mentioned. So I think there's lots of people doing good work to try and help the industry crystallise what we mean by social value, and then to kind of input it and build it in. And inevitably you will get the people doing it for the optics reasons, but I think there are, as Felicity's outlined, there has been a sea change in the industry where I think people are starting to do it for more reasons than just to be seen to.
Yeah, and I was just going to sort of follow up. I think, Leah made the point at the start in terms of metrics. You need to outline them from the beginning and from the get-go in terms of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So, as Alex said, yes, a lot of people are trying to work to standardise it, I guess. I hate standardising because I think there's a lot of intricacies within it, but I think, it's really doing it from the get-go and making sure you're clear in terms of what you want to try and have as an impact from that piece. And Liam discussed that very well earlier in terms of how they're approaching it at First Base.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for that. And Dominic, is there anything else you wanted to add before we finish?
No, not really. Just I think the panelists, we all talked at length before today, and I think the main thing which we were talked about is this is a long-term thing. It's like we can't just. It's got to be more than a buzzword which is fashionable today and then gets forgotten about and the detritus of other jargon in 2021 and 2022. Social impact, social value is long-term. It's probably never going to be finite. It's always something that needs to be worked on. But I think I just take a lot of encouragement out of what the panelists were saying, because actually there's a lot of rays of hope in terms of some great ideas bubbling up from how the community are actually responding to the crisis, responding in different ways. So I feel positive.
Thank you, Dominic. And I have to say I agreed. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that I'm sure we'll return to more and more in coming weeks, months and years. If Build to Rent wants to sell itself as being about a community, we have to understand what that means. We have to understand what social value means, how we add things, how we make life better for our residents and for our people who live with us. But anyway, on that point, I'd just like to say thank you to Dominic, thank you to everyone on the panel for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you to everyone who's attended and stayed with us. Before we wrap up, just a couple of points. Forgive the Hoover in the background. Firstly, Built ID are not just a great company in the development space and community engagement, but actually a great tech company as well. And the UKAA is working with Built ID on a partnership basis for them to develop our membership directory. But that might not be obvious as a way to go forward, but actually, if you go onto the Built ID site and you look at the consultant directory and you put in their services at UKAA, you'll see all the people who are members of the UKAA who are already part of the Built ID community. And even better, what you can see is all the projects they've worked on, all the links they've got, and all their credentials. So we think that's a super way of exposing membership and giving value to our members. And Freddie, who's on the line, Freddie was watching, and I are working together on delivering that. So that's just a little plug for us and for Built ID. At this point, I'll then say thank you and welcome again. Say thanks to our panelists, thanks to everyone who's joined us. Do join us again for our next webinar, which is next Thursday and is about the impact of COVID-19 on a full fibre network, presented by Hyperoptic and Say Property. Fascinating title. I'd be interested to know how networks, fibre networks, suffer from coronavirus, but no doubt we'll learn more then. Once again, thank you everyone for joining. It's great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.